We're now going to consider environments in which firms have the ability to set the prices of their own products. The market that we've been considering so far has been described by this familiar picture here, called the supply and demand model. Now, the illustration that I've got here is one in which, simple one where we have no externalities. So the marginal benefits that are shown by the demand curve represent social marginal benefits. The marginal costs shown by the supply curve are the social marginal costs. So there's no external benefits or external costs to consider. So that left us with the familiar situation of consumers getting a certain amount of surplus, represented by A, and producers getting a surplus, represented by the area B. Now, this particular market produces an efficient outcome, so the social marginal benefits are just equal to the social marginal costs. And if we imagined that the entire economy, that every market in the economy could be described by a model like this, then it would be the case that the market economy as a whole would be using resources in an efficient manner. The outcome, of course, would not necessarily be equitable. We could have poverty, we could have what was described as inadequacy, so the prices that emerge, perhaps for necessities in particular markets, might leave a lot of people unable to afford them. So there's not necessarily anything desirable about a market economy that is efficient but produces inequitable outcomes. So as we saw when we thought about inequality, we saw that there was a necessity to redistribute resources, to redistribute incomes, and possibly wealth, in a way to promote a more equitable distribution of income. This model is often called a competitive model or a competitive market, or more precisely, a perfectly competitive market. So what are the characteristics of this kind of market? It's got to be the case that every firm in this market is selling an identical product. That's how we can really add up the supply that every firm brings to the market. So we can add up the total quantity that's brought to the market. So if we're looking at the market for rice, then we're looking at a particular type of rice, particular grade of rice, and everybody's producing exactly the same thing. So we can legitimately add those things up. This model also says that there is a single price in the market, the market equilibrium price, and every seller sells for that price. Now, if you think about real-world markets, if you just go out and want to buy some rice somewhere in St. John, you would find that you're going to be paying different prices in different places. So this is not necessarily a very realistic description of actual markets that we experience. There are some chapters in the text which I've skipped over that go into this model in a lot more detail. I've skipped over it really for two reasons. One is that it gets into, I think, some unnecessary technical detail, which we don't really need. And it's also describing a kind of market that really doesn't exist in the real world. I would say there are virtually no markets out there that look like this. Perhaps the stock market and commodity markets, but beyond that, the markets that we interact with in everyday life are not really very well described by this model. One feature of this particular model that I haven't written down here is that the participants have perfect information or costless information. That's how a single price can emerge in the market. If we think about more realistic situations, the buyers of products don't know the prices that sellers are offering. They have to go around and search those out. So that's why I said if you wanted to go and buy a bag of basmati rice in St. John, you would find all kinds of different prices for it. So in that case, we can't talk about just a single market price. It's also assumed that people know exactly what they're buying. They know the characteristics of the products. Well, there's one other feature of this market that I'll just briefly mention that I've written down here. I haven't discussed this before, but if we imagine, say, that firms in this market are making high profits, that's going to attract new investment into this industry. So the location of supply in this market is going to be affected depending on how profitable or how unprofitable firms are. So if we allow enough time to pass, supply is going to decrease or increase in response to losses or profits. So when the situation finally settles down, it's going to be one in which firms are satisfied with being in this particular market. They can't do better anywhere else. So if we think about the idea of opportunity costs, they have no better opportunities anywhere else. So that's how we reach a long-term equilibrium in a market like this and a long-term equilibrium price. Well, those are fairly simple ideas. Let's go on and consider some more interesting kinds of markets. Economists have classified market structures, other market structures, into three basic types. One is one in which you've got many sellers. So that's kind of like our competitive market where we have many sellers, many relatively small sellers selling the same product, but here the sellers are selling different products. And this assumption of free entry or exit means that it's easy for people to enter this business or to leave it. And for simplicity, we're also going to assume that people have very good information about the nature of the product that's being sold. Now we could modify that, and instead of saying that we've got many sellers, we could have a few sellers. And they also have control over the market price, but the reason that we've got just a few sellers in the market is that it's not easy to enter this market. In other words, there are what we call entry barriers. Perhaps it requires a large investment to enter this market, for example. Or perhaps the existing sellers have techniques that are keeping new competitors out. The most extreme, we could have a market that has just a single seller. And sort of by definition, if you've got a single seller selling one product, there can't be any close substitutes for that product. Otherwise, that seller would face a lot of competition. The producers of those substitutes would be firms that we would probably want to include in this market. Why is there only one seller? Well, it must be pretty difficult to enter this market. We'll describe those difficulties in a minute. So each of these types of markets has a particular name. So this first market is called monopolistic competition. The word competition is suggesting this idea that we've got a lot of sellers and that it's easy to come and go in this particular industry. And as well, we're also assuming good information, which we are actually in these other situations as well. The thing that gives it a monopolistic flavor is the fact that the individual sellers are selling different products, so they have the ability to set their own price, at least within limits. This situation, where we have just a few sellers, is called oligopoly. And the most extreme case is monopoly, where we have just one seller. So that's a term that I think everybody will be familiar with. Well, where do monopolies come from? Why do they exist? Well, as I mentioned before, if there's just a single firm in the market, it must be difficult for new firms to enter. Why would there be barriers for new firms? One possibility is that the existing firm has some big technological advantage, and it's very difficult to enter that market and compete. So I thought of the example of Google, which has a very good search engine. I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. I think something like 90% or so of the web searches in the world are done using Google. But I did put a question mark there because I have read actually that someone did come up with an idea for a search engine that was even better, but Google was able to prevent it from effectively being able to emerge. Another possibility are what are called network externalities. So a network is a situation in which a whole bunch of people are using the product that the monopolist is providing. So obvious examples are things like Facebook or Word. So if other people are using Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever it may be, then if you want to communicate with them, you have to use Facebook or WhatsApp as well. So once the network gets established, it becomes difficult for somebody to come up with an alternative, because it's offering a product and there's initially nobody who's joined that potential network. So you'd have to persuade people to start joining your network, and only then would it grow. Another reason, common reason for monopolies, is that they're deliberately created by governments. So if you think of the protection of intellectual property through patents on production goods or techniques that are used in production, think about copyright on things like software or books, or trademarks that protect the names of products or companies' names. Those are legal barriers that are created by government to really encourage innovation and investment in creating new ideas and new products. It gives those things at least a temporary monopoly, and as we'll see, monopolies are likely to be profitable. So it's rewarding the investments in research and development that come up with these things. There's another reason for the possible existence of monopolies, and that's the idea of economies of scale. So I haven't really talked at all about costs of production in any detail in this course, but let's consider this rather familiar idea, that the greater the rate of output in a particular period of time that a business is going to undertake, the lower might be its average cost of production. There's a variety of reasons for how that could come about, but one possibility would be a business that has very high fixed costs of production and very low marginal costs. Your textbook gives the example of a city's water utility. So you can imagine there's a huge investment in the infrastructure to distribute the water and in facilities for processing the water and pumping it and so on. But the marginal cost of pumping another liter of water is going to be very low. So if you just do the arithmetic in such a situation, if we consider what the average costs of production are going to be, we'd have these very high fixed costs, and as we divide that by a greater and greater rate of production, you end up with lower and lower average costs. So there's lots of examples of this sort of thing. So if we consider what market demand might be relative to the average cost of production, we can see that in a situation like this, the firm is large relative to the size of the market. So it would actually be efficient to have a single firm supplying the market. It's going to be able to produce the amount needed at the lowest average cost. It wouldn't make any sense to break that firm up into smaller parts. That's what's called a natural monopoly. Well, in the next set of slides, I'm going to consider in some detail how we think about the monopolists' profit maximization